What if he had stolen my money? We started working together for a couple months before I noticed anything that I felt like was weird. I had this gut feeling. By that next morning, I was fully convinced that he had taken my money. I ended up getting a text from him finally that same morning that he had turned himself into the FBI. I had $35,000 stolen. The large majority of financial fraud victims will see very, very, very little, if any, of their money recouped.
Welcome to True Crime Prevention, the podcast that melds true crime with real solutions. Let's expose how all crime starts the same way, with a chance. Today, we won't give it a chance. I'm Paul DelPonte, and I work with McGruff the Crime Dog. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about financial fraud, scams, and fraudsters. I think probably everyone out there who's listening has at least had a fraudulent charge on a credit card or somebody misusing one of their online apps or accounts. Today, we're going to get into some stuff that really took someone's life savings and what we can do about it, what we can be aware about it, and what our guest, Celisia Stanton, is doing to bite back. And before we get into that, I'd like to remind everyone, please click like and subscribe. And so that's how we get viewers. And if you also want to help support the work of McGruff and the National Crime Prevention Council, there's a way you can make a direct contribution as well. Every dollar helps. Nothing is too small. We put it to good use. And we offer a return on investment that is almost 200 to 1. Everything we put out is seen by millions of people, billions of times. That's McGruff, and we're here to help. And as I said, we're joined today by Celisia Stanton. Celisia, thanks for joining us. Glad to have you on. This is a topic that I have written about, studied. Anybody who goes and is aware of crime prevention knows the old adage, follow the money. And oftentimes, once your money is gone, it's really gone. And so it's important for people to protect themselves. So again, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and to chat about my experience and kind of what I've done as a result of it.
Terrific. Why don't you start by just giving us a little bit of background about yourself, where you grew up and sort of your career, how it got started in all of that before we get into the true crime.
Yeah, so I am based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was raised over here, technically born on the East Coast, but I really consider myself a Minnesotan. I've lived here since elementary school. And, after I graduated from college, I went to the University of Minnesota. I had a degree in psychology or got a degree in psychology. After that, I kind of knew I wanted to do something for myself, have my own business. I didn't know what that was going to look like at the time. Like I felt like my exposure to what the path to entrepreneurship was like Shark Tank. And I felt like everyone on there had invented something. So I didn't know exactly what that would look like for me because I didn't really anticipate that I was going to invent something. But I ended up stumbling into photography in my senior year in school and just really fell in love with it and eventually ended up kind of building my business based off of that. And so I've been a full-time wedding photographer since then. I went full-time with my business in 2017 and, just had been doing that work for a number of years when in 2020, obviously the pandemic hit, impacted everybody and especially a lot of events. So I was doing primarily wedding and portrait photography. So didn't have a lot of access to doing that, a lot of postponements and things. And it was in that time that I really started getting engaged with my community. Obviously, as we all know, in 2020, the murder of George Floyd was a huge event that kind of sparked a racial reckoning across the country and across the globe. And that was right here in my backyard in Minneapolis. And so I started sharing about issues of racial and social justice on social media, specifically on Instagram, and really grew a platform and a following talking about those things. And so I knew I love photography. I like the storytelling aspect, but I really wanted to now do something related to that social justice work, but didn't know what that was going to look like long term because I knew social media just kind of wasn't going to be that place for me, given the fact that, I felt like it cut out so much nuance. And that was something I really cared about a lot. As somebody who I did debate in high school, I coached debate for a decade, I really like to get into the messy, critical issues with people. And so all of that was sort of the backdrop of when I ended up being the victim of financial fraud, which I know we'll get into. But that was kind of like where I was at that point.
That is interesting. And I debated for a while in college myself, and that does teach you a range of skills that you never know when they're going to come in handy in life. So, what was it like? You just started a business, you were into it a couple of years, and then obviously the pandemic, no one could have a wedding, or not one of any size. So, what was that like living through that? And sort of what was your mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I felt at the time that, it would be okay with the business and that it was like most of the folks that I was working with were still going to get married. Either they were going to do something much smaller that year or they were postponing things. So, I would still have that work down the line, but it was definitely, I think it was obviously a really jarring experience for everybody for so many different reasons.
Sure.
And so I just kind of found myself with a lot of free time, especially in that spring of 2020, and was trying to figure out how can I still be engaged with my community and how can I still be connecting with people and trying to build my business while from home, not being able
Right.
to like go out and connect with folks. So I think it just ended up being this perfect situation that I had that time to be able to talk about issues of social justice, just because I had that extra time and because it was something that the whole country was reckoning with. And so it just kind of got to a point for me, especially in my own lived experience as a Black woman living in this community. I really wanted to kind of share some of my perspective. And I wasn't expecting for some of the posts that I had originally shared to go viral, to build a platform in that way.
Hmm.
And I found that a lot of different clients started coming to me because we connected on those issues. So I think it was interesting because it ended up being an opportunity for me to realize that I had this passion, and to build on that and also continue to connect with like-minded people for the business that I was already running.
Great. And so there you were, a young entrepreneur, and all that comes along with that during this turbulent time. And I think a lot of people who work for a big company or the government or a large employer, they take certain things for granted. They take 1K, health insurance, those things. You're providing all that on your own as self-employed, right? You're
Yeah.
doing so. I think that's important to keep in context. And as we get to the point where the trouble began, so tell us how that occurred. Were you, I'm assuming you seem like the type of person who is very thoughtful and particular and meticulous about setting things up the right way. And I'm guessing that you went through the trouble of making sure you had the right accounts, the right savings, and all of those things in place as an entrepreneur, correct?
Yeah, and I wanted to start thinking a little bit longer term. I think, obviously like you were saying, if you work for a traditional employer, you maybe have a 401k that they're going to match, that you're automatically sort of like, opting into when you sign on to the job where you're going to be contributing with every paycheck, those sorts of things. And so I knew I wanted to make those plans for my own future, but I would have to kind of like lay out my own path as somebody who is self-employed. So that was why I really got into my head, I would love to work with a financial advisor, somebody who could kind of help guide me through that process. And for me, I think what was really compelling about the person I ended up working with was that we were connecting on like values as well. So this person actually had come in and spoken to the Black Employee Resource Group at the company that my mom was working at. And, he had his own financial advising business and he had gone to school with it. He was like an actual financial advisor. You could have looked him up. He would have had all the
Mhm.
right credentials. And he was also a fiduciary, meaning that, he was obligated. He had extra legal responsibilities to do what was in the best interest of his clients. And so, if you are ever somebody who's looking for a financial advisor, that's something that a lot of people would advise you. Look for a fiduciary, make sure you look them up on the appropriate channels, make sure they're able to actually provide financial advising services. And
So
so,
you did your due diligence, and not
yeah.
only did he check out, but you felt there was this extra value alignment.
Yeah, exactly. So he had spoken to this Black Employee Resource Group, and he was really talking to those folks about how a lot of his work in starting his own financial planning business was to help groups or communities that are traditionally excluded from the financial system. So that can look like, Black folks or women or small business owners, people who traditionally just haven't been given necessarily the same tools and access to learning all of these systems, or maybe don't have the same sort of like institutional or family connections. And so I thought that was really aligned with what I was doing, the work I was doing online at that time, educating on racial and social justice. So I really appreciated that alignment. So we met, like we did like a Zoom and yeah, he was just a really personable guy, really spoke to all of my pain points in terms of feeling like there were so many things to tackle and it was kind of unclear where to start. And also I felt like a lot of the resources online for people in my position weren't necessarily targeted at somebody like me. And so I found that information just harder to consume. And I didn't feel like I had a clear strategy of what would be the best direction for me to go, for me to save for these medium term goals, these longer term goals, and make kind of the best decision and risk tolerance and stuff for myself. So I felt like he made that whole process a lot simpler. He was able to kind of break things down in a way that, I feel like an everyday person could understand.
Hmm.
But also, like, I am somebody who is pretty detail oriented. And so I did have a lot of questions and I felt like he did a great job answering those. And also, he was just kind of well known in the community. So he had a lot of kind of positive endorsements from other folks who had worked with him or he was also just in general kind of doing a little bit of a like a media tour, a local media tour. He had gone on all these local podcasts, he had been featured on all these different like news publications or lots of different articles written about him. He was also at the same time starting a financial startup. So there was a lot of articles online about that work. And he'd even gotten some special funding through some of these startup programs to be able to work on that business. So there was a lot of just around him, I guess, cultural currency that he had.
Cultural
That
currency, and I'm
yeah,
sure in the eyes of someone looking for a financial advisor, you were getting all the right signals.
yeah,
Here's
exactly.
someone who's active in the community. He's building his own entrepreneurship business. He's got articles being written by him or about him. And so he's becoming more and more prominent. And so those are probably all good things when you're looking for a financial advisor, especially a fiduciary advisor.
Mhm.
And so at what point did you contract with him? What was the sort of initial arrangement like?
Yeah, so he was a fee-based advisor, meaning that I would pay him a flat fee to, manage my assets. And then also we did sort of like meetings biweekly where we would kind of talk about like the bigger, more holistic financial picture of things, budgeting and, just giving general financial advice for a set period of time. And that was another thing too. I feel like a fee-based advisor is something that is promoted a lot of times in the financial community as somebody who's going to be doing something that's in your best interests, versus like if you're working with, a company like an Ameriprise or something like that, there's some security in that the fact that they're a big company, but also at the same time, there's certain products and things that they're selling that they might be incentivized to like get you to do a specific plan or invest in certain products because they get paid for those products. So I liked that aspect as well. And so I paid his fee and then started working to transfer money that I had wanted to put into different investment accounts to those relevant accounts. And at that
Mhm.
point, he gave me a login to it's kind of like it's a website that financial advisors will use to allow their clients to be able to log in and kind of manage their assets remotely in terms of seeing like how is it doing, what is the amount of money in the account, projections, and things like that. So I had a login for one of those, and I just kind of kept meeting with him biweekly. I had started working with him in August of 2020. So we started working together for a couple months before I noticed anything that I felt like was weird. And so a couple months in late fall, he just started to become more difficult to get a hold of. He previously had been pretty responsive, but he was rescheduling meetings that we had. It was really difficult to get him, like nail him down to meet up at a different time, all of that. And honestly, this all sort of culminated in pretty much a weekend where everything kind of unraveled, which was that I started to get a really bad feeling after not being able to get a hold of him that something else was going on. And I had this gut feeling, it just kind of the thought occurred to me, like, what if he had stolen my money? And I remember talking to a number of different people about that, like friends and family, and everyone kind of had the same response, which was like,
Mm.
there's just no way that that's what's happening. Not only because, he seemed like such a upstanding like person, but also because, the thought was like, he doesn't want to go to jail. Like if he is doing this, it would be, there's a huge paper trail, like there would be major consequences. And so that was like a little bit reassuring, but not entirely because I still had that gut feeling that something wasn't quite right.
Sure.
So I was texting him, really trying to get a hold of him, couldn't get a response. And then
And,
there
and
was
question, during this time, are you still adding money into the account? on a regular basis, or?
Nope. I had basically made a couple of major transfers previous to that. Like there were just like two discrete instances, I believe, where I basically had transferred all of the savings I had to these accounts. So it wasn't like an ongoing contribution. It was kind of like two bigger transactions.
And he did not have access to your bank account, is that correct?
No, but
Okay.
I had like wired or transferred the
Wired
money over.
instructions in there,
Yes.
yeah. Okay.
Yes. And so I ended up one night kind of just like up all night, kind of racked with anxiety about this, doing a lot of research about like what it would like if I had legitimately invested my money with somebody, what would that process have looked like? Were there red flags in my process working with him? And by that next morning, I was fully convinced that he had taken my money, mostly because I was realizing that I didn't have enough information about where exactly my money was located. I hadn't received like all the documentation I believe I should have received. And then even logging into that portal, I was realizing that I wasn't sure that this portal was actually connected to a third like an actual account that I was viewing. Like it wasn't clear to me whether he could just manipulate the numbers on the back end of this software.
Sure.
And so I had like woke up that morning completely convinced that he had taken my money. And funny enough, I ended up getting a text from him finally that same morning, a text back to all of my previous messages saying that he had turned himself into the FBI, and that if I had any further questions, I could reach out at his email address.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a shocker to wake up to.
Yeah, definitely. Except for I was already awake. I didn't
Yeah.
get any sleep that night. But yeah. And so, he didn't say in that message that he had stolen the money or that what he was being charged with, just that he had turned himself into the FBI. And so then at that point, I started calling, whoever I could, at the state, trying to figure out who might be able to help me with this. I ended up getting in contact with somebody who pretty much like immediately once I got on the phone with her and started explaining to her my story and experience, she kind of had heard of the case. She was familiar with it. And she was ultimately able to pass me over to an investigator who had been investigating the case. So what I would find out later is that he had actually been under investigation by the FBI for a number of months. And in fact, I believe he was under investigation before I ever started working with him. So that's kind of one of the things that's sad about it, because ultimately, while he's being investigated, he's still working and actively defrauding more people. And so, yeah, I found out he had been under investigation, and then eventually it had all kind of come to a head. Whether or not he turned himself in or the jig was sort of up is kind of more how I feel it was. But what was interesting too is that when I got on the phone with the police officer, she never confirmed on the call my worries or suspicions. She never said like, yes, he's under investigation for defrauding people or mail fraud, which is what he was charged with. None of that. She just like would not confirm that, which I guess, from an investigation perspective is more like, well, we can't say that if it's not, clear. But you can imagine that creates some like confusion on
Absolutely.
my side, because it's just like, well, what exactly is going on? What is he going to be charged with? Where is my money? Like, I didn't have any clarity on any of that. And I just kind of was asked by her a few questions about like if the money was gone, what that would mean to me or the significance of that. And just like any information I could provide about my experience working with him and like documentation and things like that, which would have assisted them in their investigation.
So, and at this point, you said both the FBI and local authorities were involved.
Yeah.
And obviously other victims were defrauded prior to you and
Alongside
and during the same time period. And did this get news attention? You'd mentioned that, he had started building a profile for himself publicly. Did this also pop up?
Yeah, locally it did get some attention. There was some news coverage, honestly, not a ton, but some. And then there was a lot of discussion on social media and things like that. Since he was so well connected and knew a lot of people, there was just a lot of people who were talking about the case. And then come to find out, a lot of people who had been working with him who were in a similar boat to me, which is how I ended up getting connected with some of the eventually, they would end up charging him. He pleaded guilty. They charged him with one count of mail fraud, which I found really interesting considering the fact that he actually was defrauding all of his investor clients. He stole millions of dollars. And he was using that money for lavish personal expenses, cruises, clothing, services, experiences, all the things that, the money was not for, in addition to also using the money to put into his business that he was starting, his financial startup. And
Hmm.
I believe that he was sort of under this delusion that he would be able to pay this money back and everyone would be none the wiser when inevitably his like financial startup blew up. And so they end up charging him. And then he actually, even though he was charged in January of 2021, he wouldn't actually be sentenced until the summer. I believe it was June of 2021. So that's actually pretty quick in terms of like the criminal legal
Hmm.
process. But he was not brought into custody at that time. He was never arrested, actually. So it wasn't like he got out on bail or something like that. He was able to like live at home with his family, knowing also he had the sensitive information of all his clients. When you're working with a financial
Sure.
advisor, you're passing over your social security number, your home address, all of these different things. And, meanwhile, if, there were lots of folks watching his wife and his family online, sort of try to keep up appearances on social media and still kind of living the lifestyle they were living before, trying to kind of hide the fact that this was going on. And so I think for victims, that felt really upsetting and jarring because it was like, it felt like, there were minimal consequences for what he had done. And eventually he was sentenced to a prison term. And then he actually didn't have to turn himself in till several months after that. So I believe he entered prison in September of 2021. So he was able to turn himself in and he was able to spend that last few months at home with his family in that interim period. So again, kind of just a difficult thing for victims who kind of felt like we weren't let in on that process. And for me too, I felt like throughout the whole process of the whole criminal legal process was very opaque to me. I wasn't really given information about what they were doing to try to recoup some of these assets and funds and
Right.
return them to the people he had stolen them from. We weren't really we would have to reach out to them to get any information. And it was kind of like chasing things down. And I think that that's often what happens with cases in the criminal justice system. I think people think about the criminal legal process as being about justice, right? About achieving justice. But part of it is that it is a process about enforcing laws. And so
Right.
it's not necessarily about the victims and the victims' feelings, restoration, any of those things. And this process would proceed whether or not us as victims had involvement. So that was just something that I kind of found tricky to navigate.
In dealing with a lot of people who go through the criminal justice system in one way or the other, it's important to keep in mind, you go to school and people criticize civics information as not being detailed enough and we don't have enough of it. But when you think about the three branches of government, the one that we generally hear the most about is the presidency, no matter who's in the White House. It's followed by Congress. Most people have a vague notion that it takes Congress to pass a law and all that. And then occasionally we hear about the Supreme Court deciding down and handing down big judgments. And, we can think of the big cases throughout history like Brown versus the Board of Education and things like that. But the day-to-day workings of the criminal justice system, the most education people get on it, quite frankly, is watching Law and Order. And a lot of times, as you point out, the system is not set up for the victims. It is set up for a specific purpose, and that purpose is to charge people with guilt and to prosecute and convict those who are guilty. On the other hand of that, you have the victims. And then when you're talking about financial fraud, you are talking about people like yourself who've worked hard, played by the rules, thought they were making a right decision, and fell into the hands of someone who was crooked, and your money's gone. So during this process, did you get to know some of the other victims?
Yeah, I did. I know there was like one, I guess, set of family of victims that comes to mind was a couple who they were retired or one of them was retired, one of them was close to retirement. And the wife in the couple, she had a sister who had early onset dementia and she was in
Hmm.
a long-term care facility. And so they were not only managing their own retirement funds, but they were also managing the assets of her sister and her long-term care. And so they had invested all of their money, so hundreds of thousands
Wow.
of dollars, as well as their sister's money. And so, that for me as a young person who still has so much time to try to like rebuild after something like this happens, it was just so, heartbreaking to hear about other victims who weren't so lucky. And so we actually ended up organizing a GoFundMe on their behalf and we're able to
Oh,
raise over
oh,
$100,000
good
to
for
kind
you.
of,
Good for you. That
recoup some of their money. But that's the
yeah.
thing is that, most victims of financial crimes, especially folks who are defrauded, like through some kind of investment scheme, they're never going to recoup the money. Obviously if you're found guilty, well, in this case, there was no trial because he pled guilty right away. But, in any case, if you're found guilty, you will probably be required to pay restitution, meaning that you're going to have to like pay the money to your victims until you die or until you've paid that money off. But in, this guy's case, he had stole millions of dollars and now he's going
Right.
to be incarcerated for a number of years. And while you're incarcerated, you're making extremely minimal amounts of
Right.
money.
I was
So
going to
that,
say he stole the money.
right.
But probably more importantly, in terms of the inability to recoup it, is he spent the money too.
Exactly. And
He lived this lavish lifestyle, and so once money is gone, it is sadly gone.
yeah, because I think if you have invested that, if you've spent that money on like things, there's some amount of liquidation that can happen, and they did do some of that. But he had spent his money on a lot of services and a lot of experiences, which you can't recoup any of that. A house you could maybe sell, try to get some money out of that, or car you can maybe sell again, depreciate it.
Right.
It's not going to be the same thing. So they did do that. They did try to liquidate as much things as they could, or at least that, and again, that was another part of the process that we weren't really very involved in. And we did like a couple years later all get a check based on that liquidation. But what was interesting is that they split that money equally amongst all the victims, which, for somebody like me, if that feels fair, that feels like, like helpful. But also if you have had hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen versus me, I had $35,000 stolen. Well, a little bit more than that when you include his fees and things like
Right.
that. It is just so majorly different. So we got like, I don't know, maybe $1,000 or something like that. It wasn't a lot.
Right. Certainly
But
not in comparison to the amount of money you lost.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, from there, you kind of, there's like an account where restitution money will kind of accumulate, and then it gets cashed out when it hits a certain threshold. I don't remember if it's like $50 or something. I can tell you I have not received one cash out so far since he's been incarcerated or sentenced, which was back in 2021. So just to
Mhm.
give you an idea of how long it can take for that money to accumulate.
Sure.
And then,
Sure.
you also have to make sure that you are staying on top of it, that you keep your address information updated, all of those sorts of things if
Right.
you want a hope of getting any of that back. But the large majority of financial fraud victims will see very, very, very little, if any, of their money
Absolutely,
recouped.
which
Yeah.
is a sad reality of it, especially as things are becoming more and more international.
Hmm.
Once the money is gone and it's gone through a couple wires through different banks or some other laundering means,
Yeah.
it becomes, every step, every day gets harder and harder to trace and get the money back. I want to drill down on something that you started talking about toward the beginning, and that is how you came across him. Because there's an old adage. Someone once asked the infamous bank robber, Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? And his answer to that was, that's where the money is. So you met him or started becoming aware of him through his involvement in the community and his prominence. And as you said, as time went on, you started noticing he was doing more articles, podcasts, media appearances, and those kinds of things. So
Hmm.
he was building his credibility
Hmm.
as a financial advisor at the same time. And it sounded like you'd mentioned that he had targeted the African American community, minority community, especially. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. And there were also like, it was primarily women and, like I said, like solopreneurs, small business owners, things like that. Other folks that are kind of traditionally like excluded. He himself was a Black man. So I think that was something that, it's pretty rare to be able to find Black financial advisors. So I think that
Hmm.
that was something that was appealing to folks in the community for sure.
So he was trying to build a sense of normalcy to his business and to his resume and all of that, as well as affinity alignment, as it's called in marketing, so finding people who are like-minded, which is I raise it because it's a common theme among crooks.
Hmm.
It's, whether you're talking about financial crime, sexual abuse, it is, let me do something that makes me look normal,
Hmm.
that makes me look part of the community, part of, the kind of person my victim might otherwise associate with me on a regular day-to-day basis. Does sort of that
Oh,
sound
for
like
sure.
that was his
Definitely.
MO?
Yeah, it was part of his strategy, I believe, to target people who he felt like not only that were kind of similar to him and that he would be able to kind of just naturally have that trust with, but vulnerable populations who he already had an understanding, maybe didn't have the same knowledge of financial systems. So it would probably make him more able to get away with the ways in which he was conning people.
Right. Right. And so there it is. And if you look at some of the financial swindlers that we've read lot about in the news, whether it's, Bernie Madoff or some of the others throughout history, going way back to Charles Ponzi and how they rip people off, it is systematic. It's let me build your trust. Let me get your money. I'm going to spend a lot of money because, my motive for wanting to defraud people is I want to live a lifestyle that I dream about and others dream about, but I'm going to do it and I'm going to do it with other people's money.
Mhm.
And, that's the sad reality of it. So there he is. Then you got more into this, more so than the average person. I want to talk a little bit about that. You started a podcast, and so we're glad to have another podcaster on with us.
Yes.
Truer crime. And what did you, sort of tell us a little bit about in your mind? Like, was there a moment in time you're really like, I want to help other people, or I want to fight back, or what sort of went on in your mind that triggered the next step?
Yeah. So after I'd found out I'd been defrauded, it's December of 2021 now. I, was obviously very depressed about this situation that had happened. It's December in Minnesota, so it's freezing cold. That's depressing. It's the year of the pandemic. We all know that year was hard.
Right.
And and yeah, not a lot of work things going on in the winter here. And so I had just a lot of time to sit around and feel bad about myself. And what I filled that time with was binging true crime podcasts. I was binging them from like the moment I got up in the morning till the time I went to sleep. It was just something to do. I was like doing cat puzzles, listening to these podcasts. It was around the holidays too. And so I had always kind of like consumed true crime, I guess, casually. I was never like a huge avid person, but I had gotten into listening to podcasts the way a lot of people do by listening to Serial back in, I don't remember what that was, 2015 or so, 2014, something like that. When, that was kind of, I feel like the first big podcast that kind of broke open the industry. And then from there, so many other true crime podcasts came out. But also like true crime is such a big, storytelling medium. I think there's tons of documentaries, docuseries, so many ways to consume it. But my way that I was consuming it was the podcast. And so I was just finding myself constantly listening to the shows, obviously finding something addictive and interesting about the way that the stories are being told. But I was constantly pausing it to complain to my then boyfriend, now husband, about things I felt like were missing from the ways that these stories are being told. At that point, I think that what came next was a culmination of all of my experiences. Like I said before, being a Black woman living in the Midwest, being raised by gay parents, done debate, coach debate, having known I wanted to do work in this racial and social justice space and having built a platform on those issues, but not knowing what my next step was going to be. So all of that was kind of swirling in the back of my mind as I'm pausing the show and constantly complaining to Andrew and saying, like, so much is being left out. They're never talking about race or gender or sexuality or the root causes of crime or, really, what does it mean to be victim centered? I felt like a lot of shows were having this sort of new conversation that had come up, especially in 2020, and really spearheaded by like victims, family members of victims of violent crime, people like Sarah Turney, whose sister was killed by, she believes her father, others like her who are really trying to open this conversation about victim centered true crime and ethical true crime. So that conversation was already happening. But I felt like, what I was listening to still didn't feel fully victim centered. Some shows did, but some shows didn't. In that, I didn't feel like it was victim centered just to be like the victim was beautiful and had this wonderful life. Like that felt pretty shallow to me. I felt like victim centered was about how do we create communities in a society where these sorts of things don't happen again. And so I did enough of this pausing and complaining that eventually Andrew was kind of like, well, why don't you start your own podcast? And that was
Well,
really
good for you. Good for
yeah,
Andrew for pushing you because,
yeah.
essentially that's why we started this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting is the new medium that that it's been popular for a number of years, as you pointed out, but it's a different way to reach people with stories, but to do it from a true victim centered perspective. So, I tell people, people ask, McGruff sort of has this Mr. Rogers kind of like image, likes everybody. Does he ever get mad? He gets mad when people blame victims.
Mm.
And, that we don't tolerate, because if you blame a victim and that's all you hear and you block out the rest, you're missing so much. You're missing what is the motivation to commit the crime in the first place that only feeds the system to ensure that there are going to be more victims.
Mm-hmm.
Our business is preventing it. So we're trying to cut off victimhood so that, in an ideal world, there are no more people who face what you faced. That might be an ideal we may never achieve. But for each person we save, for each criminal we stop, for each person who we can teach a couple tips that says, "Oh, I wish I'd looked out for this," or I wish you'd mentioned that for a week or so, your instincts were something had already went
Mhm.
wrong, and people around you were saying, "Oh, calm down, calm down."
Yeah.
What are some things that you learned from your own experience
Uh, Learned in terms of like,
of like the crime? And, did you start blaming yourself at different points? Like, I feel, kicking yourself saying, "Oh, I was so stupid for doing this." And even though you did the things that probably you could pick up an article or pamphlet, it says things to look out for when you're selecting a financial advisor. And there
yeah.
was, they would list many of the things that he had done and that that attracted you to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally didn't blame myself, but I do think that financial crime is kind of an interesting type of crime because I actually think it's sort of similar to like sexual violence and things like that, where there is a lot of victim blaming. There's an idea that you
Yes.
could have prevented this if you had just, done XYZ thing differently. And so I definitely saw some of that conversation happening. Like I remember I saw like a tweet too that was like somebody was responding to an article about the case and was like, well, if you're stupid enough to have like worked with this guy, like you deserve what was coming to you. Something to that effect. And I feel like that's kind of sometimes the way people talk about it. I got a lot of like maybe unsolicited advice of like, oh yeah, like, you need to make sure that you check this or check that to make sure someone's on the up and up. And I think that a lot of people kind of didn't realize that in this case, like this was somebody who was a financial advisor, who was a fiduciary. Like he just broke the law. This wasn't, and not to say that if you were scammed in a way that you weren't a legitimate
Right.
financial advisor that you deserve that either. But I think it is
The fact of the matter was he was a criminal carrying out criminal behavior.
yeah, and I think, it can look so many different it can look so many different ways, and I think the way that people often think of financial crime is like, because financial crime has touched most people somebody always knows somebody who's experienced something. It's not always something as severe as what I've described, but maybe it's like, oh, they had a grandma who was scammed out of a
Sometimes,
little bit of
right.
money or whatever it might have been. And so, or we've all at least experienced, getting an email or text message that's obviously like scammy. And so I feel like the fact is, though, financial crime can look really unique and also be very complex. And people who commit financial crimes can also spend years building out a whole infrastructure and process and system so they don't get caught. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think obviously Bernie
So they don't
Madoff.
get caught, as well as to perpetuate the criminal
Yeah,
activity.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think obviously people think of Bernie Madoff often when they think about financial crimes and like big examples of that. And that's an example where, he is defrauding some, very wealthy people, well-connected people, people who I think that people typically don't think of those folks as being the victims of financial crimes, but very well could be. I think.
Right. It comes across anyway. I mean, the family that you described that you got to know, sadly, is a common instance because, going back to, if you look at asset accumulation takes time. So someone who's going to commit financial fraud ideally is going to look for victims who've had more time to accumulate assets. When you've had more time, you are older. And when you're older, you're facing different life challenges. You mentioned Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and you need that money for
Mhm.
critical care. And you're not in your 20s and you're not going to make that money back. It's
Yeah,
needed. But that doesn't factor into the criminal's mind. It's, can I get away with it?
exactly.
And as aware citizens, as people who are out there who are vulnerable, we have to keep asking ourselves, is it legit? How do I protect my money? What safeguards are there? You did something very smart. You did not like give him access to your bank account. You didn't do some other things. You gave him what sounds like were two large installments of your savings at that point in your life in hopes that he would turn it into smart investments. That's why one hires a financial advisor in the first place. So, I mean, you were doing everything right, but he was just, quite frankly, breaking the law and taking advantage of people. And there's no other way around that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I kind of gained from the situation too was a sense of like empowerment around my own finances. And I know I talked to another one of the victims about this as well. Like a lot of us who are working with him were doing so because we felt like we couldn't figure it out all on our own, like,
Sure.
especially for those of us who had our own businesses and things like that. We wanted somebody who we could just like pay to kind
Sure.
of do it for us.
Right.
Obviously to help educate as well. That
Well,
was important
your
to me,
job
but
is at that point, your primary job is to nurture and grow your business.
yeah, exactly. But I feel like after this happened, it really did open my eyes to the idea that like can take some power back in terms of like learning these systems myself, figuring out how to navigate these systems myself. I don't have to, and there's nothing wrong with hiring a financial advisor, but I also like
Sure.
didn't have to hire a financial advisor in that like I had the skills if I wanted to figure it out. I think that especially for people who are traditionally excluded from financial systems, it can just feel really overwhelming. And like, it's just like you don't have the skills to do what's necessary, but you do. It's tricky. It's tough for sure. And I think getting advice is always helpful. But I think that is empowering to kind of be like, you know what? I don't have to necessarily have this be done for me. I can be invested in my own financial future in a more direct way.
Great, great. So it sounds like you've done a great job recovering, and I want to ask one more question before we go. The most important thing that you learned since becoming a podcaster doing Truer Crime?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was really important for me to tell to create the kind of podcast that I had always wanted to listen to. And that meant, I wanted to create a show that had all of the positive elements of all the other shows that I heard. I didn't want it to be dry. I didn't want it to be the social justice show or the racial justice show. I wanted it to be a true crime show. I wanted to tell stories in a compelling way. That's how true crime is so addictive and entertaining and interesting to people. And I don't think that's like a bad thing to say that true crime is entertaining, because that is what it is. But entertainment can be used for so much positive good, right? When we're entertained, when we're emotionally invested in something, we have the energy to donate the money, to go out into our community, to help folks around us, and really trying to create a show that helps channel that energy in a positive way is really important to me. So I wanted to have that sort of compelling storytelling format, but I wanted to tell stories from my own perspective, which I felt like was a perspective that wasn't represented a lot in the true crime space. And so I tell lots of different kinds of stories. I tell stories of, primarily, we do a lot of like violent crime, but I don't just tell stories about like a victim of a murder. Of course, we'll cover those cases, or a victim of sexual violence. I also tell stories where the perpetrator isn't who you might expect. Somebody who has been wrongfully convicted. We just finished up a case about a man who is currently on death row in Ohio. He's been there for over 30 years. And, he's trying to fight for his life, So in that case, who is the perpetrator? Maybe it's the government. And so I think trying to capture and tell stories that aren't traditionally considered true crime is really important. We'll also do stories that are typically considered relegated to history. This last season, we did an episode about the assassination of Martin Luther King. In previous seasons, we've done an episode on the Tulsa Race Massacre. In doing and telling all of these stories, what I found is that single stories are so powerful. We can connect to systemic issues through a single individual narrative, because when we hear a single individual person's story, we can map our own life onto it. We can find commonalities with that person. And storytelling has the really important power of being able to humanize people. And so through the show, I really learned that being able to tell your story and to tell other stories can really connect people to taking action and creating a world that is safer for everybody.
Couldn't agree with you any more than that. We call it edutainment. McGruff has been doing that for more than 45 years now, and we will continue doing that in new and different ways. Celisia, thanks again for joining us. Your podcast is Truer Crime, Celisia Stanton. Please don't forget to click like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on True Crime Prevention.
That's an easy way to take a bite out of crime.